There was an interesting panel recently at the All In Summit between John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs and David Sachs moderating.
Right.
I was curious. Mearsheimer was making this point that, in his view, he kept saying that America is the only regional hegemon, and that our goal when it comes to China should be to prevent them or to deny them from becoming a regional hegemon, breaking out of the island chain, because then they can roam the world, right? And so I guess as I was listening to that, and Jeffrey Sachs disagreed with that. I guess I'm wondering, I don't know. So if you're the only regional hegemon and you're preventing anyone else from becoming one, that's kind of a unipolar, that's kind of global hegemony, or is that different?
Yeah, it's different because, and I'm a big fan of so much of John's work, and it's influenced my own thinking, and I think if I could say my view and his view on China and regional hegemony is very close. I don't agree with him on everything. I mean, like the Israel-Palestine issue, I have a different view, but like on a lot of these key, and I think his analysis has been really borne out in the not so much the political decision making in Moscow, but how the war has evolved in Ukraine.
Yeah.
That it's basically it's more attritional, it's more about balance of forces and resolve and so forth, as opposed to a kind of like maneuverist or whatever. And also David Sachs is a big admirer of a lot of his work. Don't agree with him on everything, the same thing, but I mean I think a really important voice. Jeffrey Sachs, from what I can tell, I don't have as much overlap with, although I also don't want a war, so I guess that part that part I agree with. But I would say on John's view, I think is absolutely right, and I agree that China has rational incentives for regional hegemony. It's standard behavior, and I think John's assessment of China has done much better in predicting China's behavior over the last generation than the China specialists.
Yeah.
If you look at what the typical China person would have predicted back 30, 40 years ago, John's assessment of this is a rising great power, much, much, much better. So, that's as a kind of realist, geopolitically focused. The one thing is, the roaming thing I agree with. One thing I've discussed with him before is that I try to get into it a little bit in my book, is I think the incentives are primarily economic. So I think the work of like Robert Gilpin, who was at Princeton back in the 70s and 80s and so forth, this is important because really the stakes of what we're talking about are economic. In a sense, what I think of as a secure geoeconomic sphere.
Okay.
Rather than pure military. I mean, usually, even going back to like the pre-modern era, Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan were rampaging around to extort, tribute, right?
Yeah.
Like even barbarian. But certainly in the modern world, what great powers want is like a big economic sphere, in my view, or guaranteed future economic growth and prospects. But the way to get that is through military force.
Okay.
Because economic sanctions and other things don't work well to force countries to be in your economic sphere. A classic historical example of this is Japan's stated war goals in 1941, which were to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which was specifically in reaction to the American attempt to embargo Japan for good reason, morally, not necessarily strategically, because we were trying to cut off Japan's oil and other natural resource imports. That's what I think China has a rational incentive for, and actually China's export-led model, Asian tiger-style model, and the fact that it's doubling down on that actually increases those incentives. In fact, I think China is almost bearing out Lenin's theory of imperialism, ironically, which was that the purpose of imperialism was to develop captive markets that like people could like dump their advanced, as I understand advanced manufacture into, and also get guaranteed resources. And that's sort of what China's doing. Like a lot of places, for instance, in Latin America, I think have been like semi-de-industrialized. I mean, the United States has been semi-de-industrialized because China's taken that over. So that's what the reason, like I actually thought about this in my book. I think the U.S. is a regional hegemon of sorts. The U.S. doesn't, the main difference is that Asia, China's area is far more important than the parts of the Western Hemisphere that is not the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the United States would probably be like around 20 to 25%, depending on the metric, of global GDP. The rest of the Western Hemisphere would probably be, certainly if you left out Canada, would be like a couple percent, below 5%. Wow. So it's like very small.
Yeah.
The Brazilian economy is fairly large, but it's not it's a lot of its natural resources and stuff. Canada is an important economy, but it's essentially like it's adjacent to the United States. Like I think most of the Canadian population lives on the border with the United States, right? Like, so it's sort of almost part of our own sphere directly. So whereas Asia, China's like 20-25% of GDP, but then you have India, Japan, the ASEAN countries. Most of the largest economies in the future are going to be in Asia, with the exception of the United States, maybe Germany, and Brazil, maybe. So that means that, like, and this is a key point that I'm always kind of stressing to the Chinese. I'm not moralizing about their, I'm not like
their interest.
Yeah, their interest and their desire for regional hegemony. That's how we behave. Yeah. But that doesn't make it okay, like or it doesn't make it something that we are going to accept. Like it's not like some trump card that they're like, oh, well, you have dominance over Latin America. And it's like, well, A, we're going to go after our interests. Yeah. And B, we've made mistakes and not always been right. And C, like Asia's just a lot more important.
Sure.
Right. And so that's the fundamental difference. And I think that's sort of, and I think that John's point, and one I share about like the anti-hegemonic basis for American foreign policy, that is deeply rooted. If you go back to like George Kennan's speech after World War II at the National Defense University, Nicholas Spikeman's work during World War II, but even farther back, and then going even farther back to like British foreign policy, we in a sense kind of play a similar role, where we are trying to avoid huge portions of the world economy being under a dominant power.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess the question with like balance of power, stability. So like, so I guess where I'm trying to figure out where the line is because in one sense you could say, all right, so like we sort of dominate, the Western hemisphere economically and militarily, China dominates their hemisphere, and then whatever, Russia and whoever dominates in the other spheres. Right. But clearly, like, we're uncomfortable with that.
Well, it doesn't net out because the numbers don't work. That's why. Like in theory, and this is actually, there are a lot of conservatives, I find, who find that idea attractive because it's like, we're going to stop these stupid wars and all that, and I'm sympathetic to that. But the problem is, like, so much more of the economic scale and growth is concentrated in Asia.
Yeah.
And that's also why we got into World War I and World War II, was because if the Germans had taken over Europe, they would have dominated the European economy, which was a source of capital, where we sold stuff. And by the way, once they do that, they can, as John points out, they can project military power beyond that. So for instance, the Chinese ships are already like going into Alaskan sea and airspace and so forth. And Chinese fishing fleets are operating off the Galapagos. So it's not like, if they're super strong, they're not going to be like, oh, yeah, you can do whatever you want over there. We're not going to bother you. No. And moreover, we are going to need to trade into and get stuff from those huge economic areas. And if China controls it, they're going to gatekeep it. Yeah. That was what we were really doing in World War II and the Cold War, I think.
So somehow we don't want to be sort of the global hegemon, but we also want to deny other people from becoming hegemons in their own region. Okay.
Which is I think it's both a reasonable goal, it's feasible. It also aligns with the interests of many, many other countries. Okay. India does not want to be under China's thumb. Japan does not want to be under China's thumb. Philippines, Australia. So like we're working, instead of like the missionary progressivism of the unipolar era, where we're going to impose, a certain form of left, Fukuyama type political society, whatever economy. This is more like, hey, and you can see this in the rhetoric, even today you mentioned social media, it's like India has a different set of traditions and cultures and but like it's interesting, the brilliant foreign minister of India, Jaishankar, wrote a piece a couple months ago in the Indian press calling for Bharat, which is I think the term they're using in India as far as I understand, but Bharat first. Mm-hmm. India first, America first. Oh, okay, here we can overlap, and here's how we can work together. And you want your autonomy, even like Vietnam. I mean, communists, negative on communism, but we have shared interests. Sure. And and I also think in a way that's actually the best way to promote republicanism and democracy anyway. Like the main reason why democratization came in this wave after in the 1990s was, well, the Soviet Union had fallen apart. So like the most powerful country with the money and the power, Lebowski, was a democracy. So it like tends to, so the best thing you can do for idealism is be strong and successful anyway. So it's sort of like overdetermined.
Yeah. And to what length should we go to prevent China from that regional hegemony?
Yeah.
Is there a tipping point where it's the risks of war too high and then we concede that hegemony? Yeah.
Well, and this is like I go into like in great depth in my book, as I think you know, is precisely this point, which is that this is a very strong but nonetheless sort of relative interest. It's not truly existential, like in the sense that we could survive in such a world. So like there is a point. It doesn't make sense to lose like multiple American cities, large cities,
in a nuclear war to
I mean, a couple points. I think it's very, very important because I think American life would fundamentally change if China dominated the Asian market, because it would become the globally dominant. And so I think in ways that we don't appreciate, we would become not just like we're not America, whatever, but like the global economy would have like this sucking sound going to Asia. And so for all of us who want, for instance, we're talking about our mutual friend, Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, for another person I have great admiration for, if you want to reindustrialize America, forget about it.
Yeah.
Or my good friend Warren Cass, like forget about reindustrializing America if China dominates the global economy.
Yeah.
Right? So like it's a very important interest. So I think we should be prepared to risk a lot. Like a lot of people. I mean, and I say that without any, interest, obviously, in that and a fear of that. But I think it's a very, very important interest. And in the sense, during the Cold War, nobody really knows what any president would have done if actually confronted with the situation of Soviets invading Western Europe. And I'm not sure, I don't think we want to go down exactly the path we did then. But we were at least willing to credibly risk large numbers of American cities. It's kind of a probabilistic thing. But the best policy, which I tried to go out in this book, is to not rely on having to lose a bunch of American cities, but rather to have a military that works with those militaries that I talked about, like Japan, India, that are strong or could be stronger in the case of Japan, but want to preserve their independence, to work with them, which is naturally working with the warp and woof of their political intent, but also the military situation, which is, as John puts it memorably, the stopping power of water, which is it's hard to invade other people across water, or in the case of India, huge mountains between China. So there's a lot of natural advantages that we can take advantage, so that we don't have to get to that point where we're like regional hegemony or like mass national catastrophe. Yeah. That the whole point of the strategy is to avoid that. Where we're seeing this like hit bone now, though, is the issue of Taiwan, which I've been arguing for many years the United States should be prepared to defend, because it is very important. But I've always said that it is a important but not vital or existential interest. Like I often use that, like it's a 70 out of 100. Okay. And so it's been really important for the United States to prioritize its military, to make it more viable, to bring down the costs of defending Taiwan for the American people, to make it a winning proposition for the chief executive, and at the same time for the Taiwanese to do more. Unfortunately, those two things have not happened. Yeah. We have not prioritized Asia, and the Taiwanese are laggardly. And so we are heading to a situation in which we are going to face such a dilemma in a more micro context with Taiwan. But if Taiwan were to fall or capitulate or be abandoned, that would be very damaging for our anti-hegemonic cause, because people would say, like, well, wait a minute, why should I trust them? And the Chinese would be emboldened, and all these things that we all know about, that the primicists always exaggerate, but which there is truth to. Sure. Like the issue of credibility, I go into the book, I have kind of a moderate version of credibility. Like the primicists say everything is interconnected, and that's not true. We won the Cold War after losing in Vietnam. But it's all the sort of real restrainers who say there's no such thing as credibility. That's not true too. Yeah. Because if you're going to get a mortgage, you got to get a credit report, right? Like, of course, if you're going to put your neck out, you're going to want to judge somebody how reliable they are. So this is where, but the solution is, like as Clausewitz says, the best solution is to be very strong. That's not what we're doing. Sure. I think there is limited interest, very limited interest among the American people for raising defense spending dramatically. So I think we should act with focus.